On September 26, 1954, a ferry called the Tōya Maru was crossing the Tsugaru Strait between mainland Japan and the northern island of Hokkaido. A typhoon hit the strait with almost no warning. Waves reached 10 meters. The ferry capsized within minutes. 1,430 people drowned. It remains one of the worst maritime disasters in Japanese history, and it was not the only one. Several other vessels were also lost in the same storm. The Tsugaru Strait had been killing people for decades. Storms, currents, ice in winter, dense fog in summer. The crossing was only about 20 kilometers wide, but the water was deep and the weather was ruthless. And every time a ferry went down, the same question came back. Why isn't there a tunnel? That question had been asked since at least the 1940s. Engineers had proposed it. Politicians had debated it. But nobody had ever seriously attempted it, because the strait presented a set of engineering problems that in the mid-20th century seemed nearly impossible to solve. The water was deep, over 100 meters in places. The seabed beneath was a chaotic mix of volcanic rock, fractured sediment, and fault zones. The strait sat in one of the most seismically active regions on Earth. And whatever tunnel you built would need to survive not just the pressure of the ocean above it, but the earthquakes that regularly shake the entire Japanese archipelago. After the Tōya Maru disaster, the conversation changed. It was no longer a question of whether Japan could afford to build the tunnel. It was whether Japan could afford not to. Hokkaido was the country's second largest island. It had millions of residents, agriculture, industry, and resources. But every person and every product that moved between Hokkaido and the mainland had to cross that strait by ferry or by air. A single storm could shut the crossing for days. The economic isolation was real, and the human cost was measured in bodies. In 1964, Japan began serious geological surveys of the seabed beneath the Tsugaru Strait. Engineers needed to know exactly what they were digging through before a single machine broke ground. What they found was not encouraging. The seabed was not one solid mass of rock. It was a layered, fractured, and unpredictable mix of volcanic deposits, clay, gravel, and zones where pressurized groundwater sat trapped between rock formations like a loaded weapon. One wrong drill into a pressurized water pocket, and the tunnel would flood. That wasn't a theoretical risk. It was the defining engineering challenge of the entire project. The surveys took years. Underwater geologists mapped the strait meter by meter, drilling test bores into the seabed from ships on the surface, lowering instruments to record rock density, water pressure, fault line positions, and sediment behavior. By the time they had enough data to commit to a route, Japan had already spent nearly a decade just studying the ground. The route they chose was not the shortest crossing. It was the one where the geology was least likely to kill them. Construction of the main tunnel began in 1971. But this was not a single tunnel. It was three. Japan's approach was methodical and cautious, and it reflected how seriously they took the risk. The first tunnel to be dug was a small pilot tunnel called a service tunnel. It ran ahead of the main bore, probing the geology before the larger machines followed. If the pilot tunnel hit a water pocket or a fault zone, the engineers would know before the main tunnel reached the same spot. The pilot tunnel was the canary in the coal mine. Except the mine was under the ocean and the canary was a team of human beings drilling into rock that might explode with water at any moment. Behind the pilot tunnel came the main tunnel, a full-size bore designed to carry railway traffic. And beside the main tunnel ran a second smaller service tunnel used for drainage, ventilation, and emergency access. Three parallel tunnels, each one serving a different function, dug simultaneously through fractured volcanic rock beneath one of the most dangerous bodies of water in Japan. The total length of the tunnel system would be 53.85 kilometers. Of that, 23.3 kilometers would run directly beneath the seabed of the Tsugaru Strait. The deepest point would sit approximately 240 meters below sea level and about 100 meters beneath the ocean floor. At the time, no tunnel in history had gone that deep under open water. The excavation relied heavily on drill and blast methods, supported by mechanical tunneling equipment where conditions allowed. Workers drilled holes into the rock face, packed them with explosives, detonated them, cleared the rubble, reinforced the new section with concrete and steel, and moved forward. Then they did it again and again, day after day, year after year. The pace was brutal. In some sections, the tunnel advanced only a few meters per day. In others, the rock was so fractured that every blast brought water pouring through the cracks. Engineers developed a technique called chemical grouting, injecting liquid sealants into the rock ahead of the tunnel face to block water pathways before they reached the main bore. It was a race between the engineers sealing the rock and the ocean trying to get in. And sometimes the ocean won. In 1976, a major water ingress event flooded a section of the tunnel with tens of tons of seawater pouring in per minute. Workers evacuated. Pumps ran for months to clear the water. The cause was a pressurized water pocket trapped in fractured rock that the geological surveys had not detected with enough precision. The engineers stabilized the section, sealed the breach, and moved forward. 5 years later, in 1981, another major flooding event hit an advancing section from the Hokkaido side. Water burst through weakened rock at even higher volume than the 1976 event. Crews again evacuated, pumped for months, and sealed the breach. These were not minor incidents. These were moments where the ocean reminded everyone that the rock between the tunnel and the sea was the only thing keeping the workers alive. The tunnel had no margin. Every meter of advance was a bet that the geology ahead would hold. Over the course of construction, 34 workers died building the Seikan Tunnel. 34 people who went underground and didn't come back. Some were killed in flooding events. Some in rockfalls. Some in equipment accidents in conditions that were hot, wet, pressurized, and lightless. The tunnel was built by hand as much as by machine, and the cost was not only financial. It was human. The total financial cost of the tunnel has been estimated at roughly 1.1 trillion yen, equivalent to approximately $7 billion adjusted for inflation. That number makes the Seikan Tunnel one of the most expensive single infrastructure projects in Japanese history. And by the time it was finished, many people in Japan were openly asking whether it had been worth it. The tunnel officially opened on March 13, 1988. It had taken 17 years of active construction and nearly 24 years from the start of the initial geological surveys. When the first train passed through, it was a conventional rail service, not a bullet train. And then came the cruelest part. After surviving the ocean, the tunnel almost lost to airplanes. By 1988, air travel between Honshu and Hokkaido had become fast, frequent, and cheap. Airlines had spent the decades during tunnel construction building routes, lowering prices, and making the one-hour flight between Tokyo and Sapporo one of the busiest domestic air corridors in the world. When the tunnel opened, the train journey through it was slow by comparison, several hours versus 1 hour by plane. Ridership was lower than projected. Revenue was lower than planned. Critics called it the most expensive tunnel ever built for the least amount of traffic. Japan had spent $7 billion and 24 years building a crossing that the aviation industry had already made economically unnecessary. For years, that narrative stuck. The Seikan Tunnel was treated as a cautionary tale about infrastructure ambition outpacing practical demand. A monument to engineering hubris. A tunnel that worked perfectly and was used by almost nobody. And then the bullet train arrived. In 2016, Japan extended the Hokkaido Shinkansen line through the Seikan Tunnel. For the first time, high-speed trains traveling at up to 260 kilometers per hour passed beneath the Tsugaru Strait. The journey between Tokyo and Hokkaido dropped dramatically. And suddenly, the tunnel that had been dismissed as unnecessary found its purpose, nearly 3 decades after it opened. But there was a catch. The Seikan Tunnel carries both Shinkansen bullet trains and conventional freight trains on the same track. Because the two types of train run on different track gauges, the tunnel uses a unique 3-rail system that accommodates both. The problem is scheduling. Bullet trains and slow freight trains sharing one tunnel creates a bottleneck. The Shinkansen currently runs through the tunnel at a reduced speed, around 160 kilometers per hour instead of its full 320, partly to manage scheduling with freight traffic and partly due to the aerodynamic effects of high-speed trains in a narrow tunnel bore that was designed decades before the Shinkansen existed. Japan is now studying solutions. One proposal involves building a dedicated freight bypass to separate the two traffic types. Another involves upgrading the tunnel's infrastructure to allow higher Shinkansen speeds. The goal is to eventually run bullet trains through the Seikan Tunnel at full speed, 320 kilometers per hour, 240 meters below the surface of the ocean. And here is what's remarkable about this tunnel when you step back and look at it as a complete story. Japan started building it because ferries kept sinking and people kept dying. They spent a decade studying the geology before touching a single rock. They dug 3 parallel tunnels through volcanic seabed in one of the most seismically active zones on Earth. They lost 34 workers. They spent $7 billion. They survived catastrophic flooding events that could have ended the project entirely. They opened it in 1988 to a world that had moved on to airplanes. They watched it sit underused for nearly 30 years. And then they ran bullet trains through it. The Seikan Tunnel was not a failure. It was early. The infrastructure was ahead of the technology that would eventually need it. The engineers who designed it in the 1960s and 1970s built it strong enough and large enough that when the Shinkansen arrived decades later, the tunnel could accommodate it with modifications rather than requiring a new one to be built from scratch. Whether that was intentional foresight or fortunate over-engineering is debatable, but the result is the same. A tunnel that was called unnecessary for 30 years turned out to be exactly what Japan needed when high-speed rail finally reached Hokkaido. There is a lesson in that, and it's not a comfortable one. Sometimes the most important infrastructure is the kind that doesn't make sense when it's built. The demand isn't there yet. The technology hasn't arrived yet. The economics don't work yet. But the geology won't wait. The ferries won't stop sinking. And the window to build, when the political will exists, when the funding is available, when the engineering talent is assembled, may not stay open forever. Japan built a tunnel that the present didn't need because someone believed the future would. They were right. It just took 30 years for the future to show up. 53.85 kilometers long, 240 meters below sea level, 34 lives lost, $7 billion spent, 24 years from first survey to first train. And now, 3 decades later, bullet trains cross beneath the ocean floor through the tunnel Japan built long before high-speed rail reached Hokkaido. The Tsugaru Strait still churns above it. The storms still come. The old rail ferry dependency ended years ago. And 240 meters below the waves, trains pass through in silence. The ocean never even knows it's there.